Welcome to Wilderness Master 101, a outdoor skills course brought to you by WildernessMaster.com. I'm Luke Stevens, your host, and let's get started today. Today's episode is fire making basics, fundamental, and material discussion. We're not going to make you fire today, pyros, but we will soon, so stay tuned. Fire making is a basic skill that any outdoorsman needs to have. Fundamentally, fire making is one of those skills that if you're going to spend any time outdoors, you got to have it. Don't mistake the fact that you may only go a few hours outdoors, or maybe you do truck hunting and think you'll never need fire. Hey, let's face it, look at the world around us. Everything, lights, air conditioners, stoves, they all depend on fire. Even the cars we're driving when we might be truck hunting. But have these basic fire making skills at your disposal. So let's get started with understanding the fundamentals of what it takes to make a good fire and some basics about fire material. Now there are three elements to any good fire. The first is fuel. I'm not talking about pulling up to the gas station, getting you a tank of gas here, folks. Talking about practical fuels that you can find in the environments around you or that you have with you. Now, sometimes if you bring things like camp stoves, you may use some of your camp stove fuel to augment that. But fundamentally, when we talk about fire making here, we're talking about using the most primitive of fuels, the woods around you, things that you can find that you can harvest from your environment and burn. Now, pretty much if you understand chemistry or physics, anything in the world ultimately is fuel. If you raise the temperature hot enough, everything pretty much burns. But when you're out in the outdoors and you don't have plasma torches or, thermonuclear reactors, you got to deal with practical elements here. So let's talk about those in a minute. The other thing you have to understand with fuel is that the fuel needs to be burnable. So you might find something that looks like fuel, but due to the fact that it's green, it still has water content in it, it may not be a good source of fuel. All right, that's the first element to a great fire. The second element to a great fire is heat. And there's two aspects to heat. You gotta have heat to start the fire, but you also have to use the heat from your fire to maintain the fuel sources burning. If you don't, then your fire is ultimately going to go out. So a lot of people get the heat when it talks about striking a match and sticking it in there, getting it to ignite. But what a lot of people miss is keeping that fire nice and tight within reason, not a ball that doesn't get to the third element I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but that keeps that heat contained and builds a coal base and builds the fire's heat so that it's self-sustainable. Think about fires as being their own little reactors. Not a nuclear reactor, but just a reactor. And that's what it is. And the third element that we got to talk about is oxygen. It's everywhere around us, but guess what? It's really easy with a fire to starve it of oxygen. And we'll talk about some of that when we get into the actual structure and composition. But understand that if your fire is not getting, it can have fuel, it can have heat. If it's not getting oxygen to it, it's not going to burn, folks. Oxygen is that element that makes it burn. So let's get into talking about some materials. Now we got a couple of Pyrex trays here. We're not going to catch anything on fire today. Too bad. But we will in the next episode. And I want to kind of break off the material we're going to talk about here, which is our fuel, into two groups. This is the fire starting group, and this is the fire sustainment group. And each group is important to understand, and we'll talk about them individually. So let's get started with the fire starting group. As you can see, I have an assortment of fire starting materials here. We have some pine straw, we have some birch bark, we have some leaves, and we have something here you're going, hey, what's that gray glob in there? Well, it's a fire starter you may not think about. It's lint out of your dryer, or if you're really bad, maybe out of your belly button. Now, believe it or not, tip and trick here, you do keep a fair amount, especially when you're in the field and you have the friction of your clothes up against you, of lint stays on your body and in your belly button, and it may be the place that you harvest that lint from in an emergency situation. That said, these all represent natural, environmental, and things you can carry along with you that make great initial fire starters. Now, a few pitfalls. Pine needles, we find them everywhere. They're evergreen trees everywhere in the world pretty much. In fact, they're probably the most abundant trees out there. That said, pine needles, if you notice, are really thin and spindly, and unless you get a good bunch of those, they don't produce enough heat to sustain the fire and keep it going. So be careful with those. And also, because again, they're small, a little bit of moisture turns them into complete worthless fire starting material. Leaves, great. They're like birch bark that we'll talk about in a minute. They have big surface area. They develop a lot of heat with them normally. But one downside to leaves, again, a little bit similar to pine straw, a little bit of moisture, and they can suddenly not be a great combustible element. And it's really kind of strange because you can have a leaf like this that looks dry as a bone, and it actually still has a fair amount of moisture in it. So always make sure, I normally do a crumble test. If they crumble and they just break apart like old paper, then you're probably pretty good with them. Now let's talk about birch bark. Here's the bigger piece right here. Birch bark, I love this stuff. You find birch trees across a lot of the world and in a lot of different environments, and across North America you find a lot of it. Birch bark is great. It really is dry old paper kind of stuff. That said, it also has some sappy stuff in it, very similar to pine rosin, that makes it burn a lot better when wet than any of this other stuff other than maybe the lint in here. So birch bark is a great alternative. Now, the reason why I threw the lint in here, because you're not going to go out in the woods and find balls of lint like this. You find those in your dryer, for those of you who don't have a clue. But one of the things I like to do is I keep this dryer lint around, and I always carry a little bit with me. You can put it in a baggie. I like to put it down in straws, just standard plastic straws that you can find at your grocery store. Seal off the ends of them. Some people staple them, some people tape them, and always keep one on me. It weighs nothing, and a small amount of this stuff may be the thing that saves your life one day when you need a fire. Now, what if all of this is wet, including my lint? Because you get that wet enough, it's not going to burn either. What other choices do you have in an environment to get a fire going? Well, there's a couple areas that you look at when you have an environment that is becoming restrictive on your fire starting material. That could be because of environment, like you look at a desert, and a lot of deserts don't have great foliage that's fallen on the ground. It could be because you're in a wet area, a rainforest, it's monsoon season where you're at. Or it could just be that you fell into the bad luck pit that day and everything's just not there, whether it's wet, whether it's not available, whatever. Well, you want to look at some other options in the environment. This is where you have to kind of have some extra knowledge. So for instance, in most environments where you're going to find pine needles, you may also find pine sap. And a little ball of pine sap, which you can get by carving into the tree and letting it bleed for a minute, can be the rosin that acts literally like gasoline in some cases to get things started. Now, you need to be a little bit more careful about that because a big ball of rosin is not going to light up really quick, but it could be that fire starter that gets you there. The other thing, pine trees, if you look at their kind of relatives like sagebrush and rosemary and things like that, they exist even in some very harsh environments like the desert. So you may find elements like that that can help you start fire even in very harsh environments. But you got to know and think out of the box at that point in time and not just think about your normal fire starting stuff. Now, a few things that aren't great fire starters. Well, let me tell you, these clothes, for instance, aren't. A lot of people will get out in the woods, they'll get panicky, they'll realize they're wet, they'll pull their underwear that's dry in their bag out, and they'll start trying to catch their underwear on fire. Well, hopefully it's cotton underwear to begin with, but even at that, most clothing nowadays are made with some sort of fire resistance or fire retardants, and it's just not going to work well. So clothing isn't always the best option. A lot of people try to go and shave things off of trees, and if it's anything other than the dense part of winter where trees and plants have completely shrunk down their sap into their root base, you're probably going to find stuff is still too wet there. So you got to think out of the box. I tend to like to use a test of, is it dry? Is it crumbly? And can I create, as we're going to talk in the next class, a ball that I think is going to be able to get hot enough and catch on fire with the smallest amount of spark or ash. Because oftentimes, even if you're doing a one match drill, you may be dealing with very quick, that match may burn and then go out because it's wet or the wind's blowing. So just make sure your fire starter material is the right material. All right, now let's talk about fire sustainment. Now, one of the big things that people make as a mistake when they're starting a fire is they jump from fire starter to this. That's not going to burn, and this is horribly dry. And it even has some, you can see some of the bark coming off of it. There's just not enough heat in what you're typically going to use to get a fire started with your fire starter to jump to this. So what you got to do is find some dry wood that's really small, stuff like this. Stuff even better, like this piece right here. Look at how small that is, and look, it just broke off when I touched it, or those right there. You want to get started with your smallest material, because remember, you're going to have this little ball of fire and you're going to be going trying to get that thing going oftentimes. So start small, sticks. If you have some more pine straw, that can help, but you don't want to just throw globs of pine straw because it burns up really quick and doesn't really give you a lot of heat or cold to follow up. So I like to find a lot of sticks. Even if it's been raining, if you look up underneath the pine straw, the leaves that are out there, you can find dry sticks. And you want to kind of stage them. You want to move them up. As your fire builds up, you want to kind of move your material up to where you get to this bigger stuff ultimately. And you don't just jump from here to here quick. You take your time. Keep that flame going. Work it up. All right. Well, we've talked about some starting material and some sustainment material, and that's the purpose of the show today. The next episode of fire making, we're going to get into actually how do we start them and my two basic techniques that I recommend to people always being able to have available to them. I'm Luke Stevens. This is Wilderness Master 101, and you can always find us at WildernessMaster.com. Thank you for joining us.